Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jen Hicks. I'm the Director of Communications and Outreach with Maine Woodland Owners, a nonprofit membership supported organization that focuses its expertise and resources to help woodland owners in the state of Maine be successful in their goals for their woods. Today, we are going to be discussing one of the things that we do as an organization, which is legislative advocacy for and serving as the voice of woodland owners in the legislature. Our executive director, Tom Doak, will be presenting today. He's going to provide an update. The legislative session started in January, and I think it's 132nd legislature, and it will continue through June. And Maine Woodland Owners puts a lot of resources and time into following the bills, hearing about anything that might be impacting woodland owners, and then speaking out on behalf of the good bills and working with legislators and policymakers to ensure that bills that may not be so great maybe either get tabled or are made better. So Tom's going to provide everybody an update. It's, I would say, a quieter session this year than it's been in the past, but doesn't mean that there aren't things that people need to be aware of. So as I'm sure most of you know, Tom, he's been our executive director for over 20 years. He was the state forester for Maine in the early 2000s. He has been a very respected presence in the legislature in Maine for many, many years, has been an important influence in some of our most important policies, including tree growth tax law, making sure that that is preserved. Not that he created it, but to make sure that we continue having something like this tax law so woodland owners can benefit, and as well as protecting our hunting prohibition on Sundays so that woodland owners and landowners have their land available to them on Sundays. And many, many other programs and resources that the state has enacted because of his wisdom and his presence in that area. So without any more words, I'm going to pass the mic over to Tom. And this is going to be, again, an overview, and I know he wants to hear from you folks and wants to answer any questions that you have about this year's legislative session and any particular bills that he would like to make sure everybody knows about. So thanks again for being here. Again, send your messages on chat, or you can also, I believe, Tom, you're okay with people asking you questions as you're doing your presentation?
Oh, just raise your hand, whatever. Yeah.
Yep. You can use the hand icon or turn your video on and raise your hand. If you're not speaking, I'd ask that everybody is muted just to ensure that we have good sound quality during this presentation. So please mute your sound until you're ready to ask or need audio to communicate. Okay, Tom, it's all yours.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone. And in a typical session, oh, I'm muted. Oh, okay. Yeah. For some reason I get muted. Welcome. And this is the first session of a 2-year session of the legislature. Typically in the first session, you see about 2,000 bills, 2,000 or so bills that the legislature considers. There's a list of all bill titles that are in, but sometimes it's really difficult to tell from titles whether the bill impacts landowners or not. But I have gone through the list, and I have identified just by title about 50 bills that I think are either going to affect landowners or potentially could affect landowners, and there'll be more as they get printed. So we've only printed 660 of the 2,000 bills that we actually see the language on so far. So there'll be others, but there are about 50 that we kind of flagged there's 10 that I'll talk to about right now. And I'll do that kind of quickly, and you're welcome to interrupt me at any time if you'd like. So there are actually a couple of bills in on there are actually 3 bills in that I'm aware of on ATVs. And 2 of them, so a few years ago, a bunch of us landowners got together with the ATV community and farmers and everything, and started looking at the size of ATVs that are operating in the state, and said 95% of the trails in Maine, ATV trails, are on private land. The landowners didn't sign up for some of the size of the ATVs that you see going down trails. They signed up for these ones you sit on, and they're relatively low speed. And now we're seeing, huge ATVs the size of vehicles, and air conditioning and stereo systems. And anyway, so worked out a deal that said, put a size limit on what you can register as an ATV in the state of Maine. You can always, you don't have to be registered to operate an ATV on your own land. So, but if you're off your own land, you have to have a registered ATV. And so we established this limit on the size of ATVs. And actually, everybody at the time that owned an ATV was grandfathered, so that was registered. So we've captured all that. That was only 2 or 3 years ago, and we're already seeing attempts now to increase those limits. And so, I expect there'll be a lot of discussion about that, about ATVs and raising the limit right now is can't be any wider than 65 inches, and it can't weigh more than a ton. There are proposals in to allow the limit to go up to 2,500 pounds. There's one in there about 3,500 pounds. There's one that would allow ATVs to operate on any road, any public road that has a speed limit less than 50 miles an hour. So we'll see those. Our position is the deal is made, and landowners, there's no advantage to landowners to have this increase, and they don't really want the ATVs anyway. And so stick to the limits that everybody agreed to, and build the trail network to maintain the standard that exists. So I'm assuming there'll be a fight on the size of ATVs and the operation of ATVs. And somebody if you have a question about any of the topics, please interrupt as I go. So I'm going to go to the next bill. One of the things that we've seen a lot more in the lands, we own 76 parcels of land in the organization now that in our land trust program. But one thing we've seen a lot of in the last few years are game cameras and tree stands that are not legally placed on our lands. And I'm hearing more and more from members that they're seeing the same thing. In Maine, just a reminder, if you're going to put a tree stand, have a game camera, trap, or ride an ATV, you must have the permission of the landowner. And on game cameras and tree stands and trapping, you must have the permission of the landowner, and you must label both your tree stand, game camera, or trap with your name and contact information. But what we're seeing is a proliferation, frankly, of game cameras and tree stands. And our policy on our own lands, the lands we own, is they're all open to hunting, but we don't really want to deal with the issue of game cameras and tree stands. The question becomes, what happens? What can a landowner do if they find a tree stand or game camera that's not legally on their property? And I think in the practice has been many of them will just take them. But the question is, can you take them? And so there's a bill in to clarify the law that says if you find a tree stand on your land or game camera on your land that is not legally placed, so you haven't given permission, it's not legally labeled, it's considered abandoned, and it's yours. You can do whatever you want with it and dispose of it. That bill hasn't been printed yet. It's a bill that we put in, and I think that's likely to pass. There's a similar law to ice shacks that are left on people's land. And so, again, I think the practice is most people take them anyway, but this would make it clarify in law that it's yours if you find it and it's not legally there. I think there'll be wide support for that. I think that's likely to pass. Wouldn't be a legislative session without Sunday hunting. There's at least one bill in. I think there's going to be two, but it's hard to tell from the titles, but I'm pretty sure there's a second one. But the one that's in that I've seen allows for youth hunting. So if you're 18 years old or under, I think it is, or enrolled in high school, and you can hunt on Sunday. That has been tried before. It's never passed. I have a list of all the Sunday hunting bills. I think there have been 79 total Sunday hunting bills that have been rejected by the legislature. I personally have been involved in about 25 of them. Interestingly, there was a survey done at the a very extensive survey done in the 2 years ago on Sunday hunting that assessed what the public thought of Sunday hunting, what hunters thought, and what landowners thought. And the interesting thing is the item that showed up the least favorable among hunters and among landowners was youth hunting. That young people out there with a gun on the Sunday without the landowner knowing they're there. So I don't see that as a major push. Certainly there are forces that will push it. There were national groups in the last few years that were pushing that. There may be again this year. The Commissioner of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife is on record saying, no way, we will not support any Sunday hunting in any form because we know the landowners do not want it. And the survey information shows the landowners are overwhelmingly opposed, and so is the general public, and hunters are opposed if they think they're going to lose access. And landowners have spoken loud and clear in the survey that they will restrict access if we pass Sunday hunting. So it will be a fight. It always is a fight. And we'll call on our members if we need them. But I think there's less energy around those bills than there has been in the past. So I'm happy to report I don't think there's a bill in on tree growth this year to amend the tree growth tax law program, at least not an obvious one yet by bill title. There is a bill in on amending the open space program, which we have been supportive of. We think the open space program is underutilized. It's an alternative to tree growth. It's different. It doesn't provide quite the value as far as a tax value reduction that tree growth does. But in many ways, it's better suited for some landowners that don't want to harvest or don't want to have a management plan, those kind of things. And there will be, it was there last session and didn't pass, but it's back again. And I think tweaking the open space law for people that acquire land that don't want to meet all the standards of tree growth, it's a good place to go. It's current use taxation. You can transfer from open space to tree growth, or open space from tree growth to open space, or open space to tree growth without a penalty. So it's a place for people that don't really want to meet the standards of tree growth to go. And I think it has a shot at passing this year. It hasn't been, tree growth has been amended or proposed to be amended almost every legislative session since it went into play in the early 70s. The open space program was actually put into law about the same time as tree growth, but it's had very, very few reviews and edits. So it's out of date, and I'm optimistic that something good can come out of open spaces that's helpful to landowners. So we'll be spending a fair amount of time, a fair amount of time on that. There's a interesting issue. Oh, I gotta know. What changed? So Tom Dodd, your question is, what change would you do to the tree growth of the open space bill? What would you change in open space? I think is your question. Right now, the benefits that you get for being an open space, I think, are too low, and the difference between open space and tree growth for valuation purposes of a landowner are often very drastically different. So what we're talking about is, and open space works on a reduction from the full taxes. So if you keep land open, if you're enrolled in open space, again, you agree not to develop your land, and if you change your mind, there's a substantial penny, and there's a reduction in your taxes for that. If you keep land open to the public, there's a reduction for that, which those two add up to about 45% off your tax bill. Tree growth can often do a lot more than that for someone. So we want to look at I think those numbers for enrolling your land in open space should be a further reduction than, I think it's 20% for putting your land in open space. I think that's way too low. There's also a proposal that would give you a reduction if you implement a wildlife enhancement practice that's approved by Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. I think that's a positive for landowners. There's an potential option if you're doing something related to sequestering more carbon. That's an interest. There's an interest there around that issue. So I think those are the kind of changes that are likely to come to open space, getting it a little bit closer to the value of tree growth. Not as good as tree growth as far as reduction, because tree growth has more hoops to jump through. But I think it's a good place for some people to go. So I think those are the changes that those will be the changes anyway that will be debated. Hope I answered that, Tom. If not, send another note. There's an interesting bill that was in. We have members and landowners that are having brush dumped on, people's yard waste and dumped on their land. Just pull up and dump shrubs and yard waste. Not like a small amount. I mean, like truckloads. Turns out there's nothing in the law that prevents someone from doing that on your land. And there are people that have these big brush piles left on them, and there's nothing that can be done. So there's a bill in, and it's likely to pass, that adds debris and yard waste to the definition of litter, which I think is kind of an interesting bill. And I'm assuming it will only be used in extreme cases, but there's been some landowners that are having trouble with people just dumping huge piles of brush, organic matter on their lands. And the legislature understands that issue. I think that will likely pass. It won't affect, it's not something that most landowners have to deal with, but there are some that are dealing with it. One of the bills that's taking a lot of time and been a little frustrating for us as an organization is a bill dealing with municipal ordinances. This bill has actually passed twice in the legislature, but it was never allowed to come to a vote by the full legislature. So under the rules of the legislature, any bill that has not been dealt with when they adjourn, it automatically dies. And the president of the Senate for the last 2 terms has not allowed that bill to actually be heard by the full legislature. There's a different leader there now. I expect this bill will eventually get a vote. But the law in Maine says a town can adopt any ordinance regulating timber harvesting it wants to, provided it follows a very specific set of process to do it. And that process includes, if you're going to regulate timber harvesting in a local ordinance, you have to have a licensed forester involved in development of the ordinance to assist the town. You have to give a draft of that to the Maine Forest Service. You must hold a public hearing on the draft. The Maine Forest Service must be allowed to participate in that and speak at that public hearing about what they see or how they feel about that draft. And the final version must be sent to the Maine Forest Service, and they will publish it. Unfortunately, there are a number of towns, and that law has been in place. I was director of the Forest Service when that went in. So it's been 20+ years. There are a number of towns that have adopted local ordinances without following the process. So this bill would basically give towns 4 years to bring them into compliance. And also basically say, unless the Forest Service certifies the process has been followed, it is not a legal ordinance. Again, the town can do anything it wants. The Forest Service has no authority to say you can't do this, but you got to follow this process. It doesn't seem like a complicated bill. It's designed to help the municipalities get into compliance, but it seems to have a lot of energy around it, and it's been frustrating dealing with it. One more shot at this, and if not, I think the solution is the Maine Forest Service needs to send a letter to all these towns and saying, if you didn't follow, here's the process. If you didn't follow it, you don't have a legal ordinance, and you better fix it. But this was meant to assist the towns and kind of encourage them to fix these local ordinances that we know are there. And we don't know about all of them, but we know some towns that have them. seems like an easy one, but it's one of these that every once in a while you get a bill that you think this makes perfect sense. And it's difficult to get through. So the interesting thing is this come up twice before in the legislature, and not a single person has testified in opposition to the bill. So it's an odd, I've just never quite seen something like this happen where you get a unanimous vote of a committee and the bill never gets even voted on. I think this is the only time I've ever seen that. I believe it will get voted on this time, but whether it gets finally passed, I don't know. But that will be one we'll be working on. There are like at least 3 or 4 bills in on related to public access to private land. And I think the intent is to look at how do you encourage landowners to keep their land open. There's a fear that from the people that use private land, that they're going to start seeing more leasing of land and people shutting off land and things like that. So I think these bills are around that, to look at what are the ways to keep private land open for public use. Which is a good concept, and we can talk about that. I'm just not sure what the pure motivation is behind, but there's 3 or 4 bills related to that. And it will probably come down to a single bill. My guess is the outcome of this session on these bills, there'll probably be one of the 4 bills that goes forward. It will probably be some kind of study group or advisory group that gets together and looks at this issue and reports back to the legislature. I'm pretty sure that would, if I was betting, that I would bet that's where that bill's gonna go. Because there is some concern there about a loss of access to private land. The interesting thing, people want to blame people from out of state for posting land. The survey work that's been done, we did some and with the conjunction with the University of Maine, and believe it or not, Maine people that are Maine residents have a higher percentage of posting land than people that own land that live out of state. It doesn't sound like people would think that, but what happens is if you're from out of state and you're not here very often, you tend not to post the land. It's the people that are here and maybe even living on the land or using the land that are residents that see more of the impact. And those are the people that tend to post their land bill. But we want to blame people from away, to say that, but actually that's not what the data shows. So I'm sure there'll be a bunch of discussion around that. There's a couple other bills that I wanted to bring up. There's a constitutional amendment proposed that would have the right to a healthy environment. Sounds like a great idea. Who doesn't want a healthy environment? The challenge with that, and this bill has been proposed before, and remember, constitutional amendments to go forward need 2/3 votes in the legislature, which are difficult to get. But if you remember a few years ago, the right to food bill, constitutional amendment got out through the legislature with a 2/3 vote, and actually went to the public and they voted for it. That, of course, triggered the lawsuit, if you remember, that said it should be legal to hunt on Sunday because people are doing it for food, and that was the basis of a lawsuit that claimed that you couldn't prohibit hunting on Sunday because people were going to feed themselves under the constitutional amendment of the right to food. Well, the Maine Supreme Court actually ruled that that's not correct, and that the state has the ability to regulate hunting under the constitutional amendment, and they are regulating hunting. And part of that regulation is you can't hunt on Sunday, and so the court basically said it doesn't apply. But you have a bill in the right to a healthy environment, but what does that mean, and what impacts does that have? And right to a healthy environment means what can you do and what can't you do? So it's probably not going to get 2/3 of a vote, but it's probably one of those issues that will, if it were to pass, it would open up a lot of discussion about, well, what is that actually going to do? Because when you start amending the Constitution, it's a pretty simple amendment, but then you have to figure out what is allowed, what isn't, and what does that change. Similarly, there's a bill in to amend the Constitution for the right to hunt and fish. And again, what does that mean? The right to hunt and fish, does that mean without restriction? Does that mean you can't regulate when does Sunday hunting get kicked into that? So those are kind of bills that we are watching to see what actually happens with some of those. And then there's a whole pile of bills called concept drafts. And let me give you an example of a bill with a title that has a concept. An act to support agriculture, conservation, and forestry in Maine. I don't know what that means. It could affect landowners, it might not. It's a concept draft. There's no language that comes with it. It's a printed bill that says, we'll fill in the details later. Now, the legislature did make some changes to the laws in the past. You could do that, put a bill in there, and you could show up at the sponsor could show up at the hearing with an amendment, with an entire bill that you had never seen before. So you go into the hearing, don't know if you're in favor of the bill or opposed to it or even care about it. And you get there and the sponsor hands out the bill. And then you have to kind of wing it to whether or not you want it, you don't want it, or you don't care about it. So there is now a provision that you have to, there's a time before the hearing that you have to release the draft, at least, of the concept draft, so you get to see it before you go into the hearing. But it still makes it really difficult, and there's a bunch of those bills in that I flagged that relate to forestry, environment, conservation, and things like that. And usually what happens, the legislature didn't have it fully thought out, but they ran up against a deadline to submit a bill. So they put a concept draft and said, well, I'm going to keep working on it. But those are tough ones. So you just don't know if they're going to apply to you or not, or to landowners. And at least this year we get, I'm trying to remember, I think it's like 2 days notice or something like that of what the language is before you walk into the hearing. So at least it's, at least it's something. Those are kind of the ones that, the other one is actually a rule that is going back to the legislature for approval. And it has to do with, you wouldn't think it would affect landowners, but it has to do with mitigation for transmission and solar projects. The challenge is the DEP, the Department of DEP, and brought a rule to the DEP board, which had to approve the rule, and to deal with this issue. But included in that is a definition of large undeveloped blocks of land. And it basically says, if you are impacting a large undeveloped block of woodland, you've now defined it as kind of almost like a zone, so that anytime you're impacting a large undeveloped block of land, you have to provide some compensation. And that's kind of a regulation on large blocks that we've never seen. Turns out that's about 70% of the land in Maine would fall under the definition of a large undeveloped block. And the argument is, well, it only applies to solar power, to solar sites and transmission lines. But once you put into statute or into rule that there's a definition that these blocks must be mitigated, now you're starting to affect any activity that would occur in those blocks. And it's not a long stretch to say, well, all activities, it's transmission lines and solar projects now, but what about this project or that project? And you're starting to affect the value of land. Our argument is there certainly are woodlands that are important, but we've never seen something that says basically just the size of a block is automatically a special site that needs protection. as I said, some blocks of land hold the earth together. And usually you see something that says it's wooded land and it has a rare plant or rare animal on it, or it has certain characteristics, that make it really stand out and special. But this is essentially saying 70% of the land in the state of Maine now would be in a zone of undeveloped blocks. We oppose the rule. The rule was adopted by the Board of Environmental Protection, but it has to come back for approval by the legislature. And I think there will be a big fight on that. And we are working with a bunch of folks to take this undeveloped block is just a small piece of the rule, but we want that out. We think that's inappropriate to just automatically say, just because the size of the property is always a very unique thing. Because we think it's not a good idea to just, it's such an overreach, or to say that every single block of land in Maine is special. And needs some kind of protection. You need to have other attributes other than just, and again, we're talking in southern Maine, we're talking about blocks of 150 acres or more, and in northern Maine 250. But again, it's not a single owner. It could be 150 acre block in southern Maine could be made up of 30 different owners that own, somehow it's you could own 10 acres and 8 acres and 50 acres, and they're all abutting each other. But if it adds up to 150, now it's a large undeveloped block. So that will be a problem. We're working on an alternative to get that bill, to get that language out. I think there's an opportunity to have the administration potentially agree to modify that language, but that will be, and that rule is not yet in front of the legislature, but I think it will be in the session, and that will be a bit of a struggle in dealing with that. So landowners are drawn into this issue of transmission lines and solar projects. And I gotta tell you, there's a lot of bills in on carbon or related, specifically more or less relating to solar arrays and things like that. There's a whole long list of, we don't usually get involved in the energy issues, but they're drawn into them here from a landowner point of view. So there are a whole bunch of other bills. Again, I've said there's about 50 that I think have the potential, at least 50 that have the potential to affect landowners. But these are 10 of the ones that I am I know will have some impact. And again, the titles of some of these bills, an act to improve Maine's environment and protect natural resources is another title, but it doesn't have any language, and that's another example of a concept draft. So we have no idea whether that has anything to do with woodland owners or not. An act to amend certain inland fisheries and wildlife laws and things like that. You don't know those things. So that's one of the frustrating parts when you go in dealing with things we just don't know yet. And the other thing to know is sometimes a bill that doesn't affect you and end up getting amended, and it does impact you. And that's why you have to be kind of in the room at some of these that doesn't affect you in the original version, because they can get amended in ways, if you're not sitting there and saying, wait a minute, it can be amended in a way that does impact landowners. And if nobody's there to speak on that part, then sometimes these things get put into, start down the process, and you have to try to catch it. It's better to be able to get up and say at that point, wait a minute, this is what this really does. So I don't know if anybody has any particular question about anything I said, or wants to ask a question about any particular bill, or has an area of concern that they want to know whether I've seen anything about a particular area, but I'm open for questions. And Jen, are you still on? Yes, you are, right?
I'm on, yes.
About $1 million.
So,
I contacted, person you let,
Okay.
Is there anybody have a question or a comment or anything issue they want to raise? If you do, you're welcome to open your camera and ask the question or put it in the chat or.
I don't want to put Richard Ness on the spot, but since we have a little bit of time right now, and this is our 50th anniversary year, Richard is a board member of ours. And he mentioned, and he was a state legislator in the 90s. And he was telling me a few stories about when he was a legislator and Maine Woodland owners' role in getting more involved in issues around woodland ownership in the legislature. Richard, I didn't know if you wanted to share a little bit of what you were talking about. Primarily, it was the timber trespass issue, but I thought it would be nice for you to, or just any thoughts you had about Maine Woodland owners' work in the legislature, coming from as a former legislator.
Yeah, it was interesting to, this is we're celebrating our 50th year. So I was in the legislature starting in 94. And I was just barely a landowner, so I didn't have any experience. I had an old chainsaw, was cutting some firewood, and I ended up in the legislature and ran into what was then the small thing. It was SWOM was called it.
Yeah.
Lawrence was there on a timber trespass bill, and he preceded Tom Doak, I think, in this. Tom was running the forestry department. And so it was my first contact with woodland owners, and Peter was very good. He was from Portland. His land was up in Washington County, I think, but he was a Portland kid, and he did an excellent job. And the bill passed basically. So it was all about stealing somebody else's wood. So the legislature agreed with him and said, "Don't do it, and here's the penalties for doing it." So. It seems like a long time ago, but it was my first introduction to it. And again, I had no experience with being a landowner other than we owned a small piece of land in Acton. Now we have a much larger piece, and we're very much involved with the Maine woodland owners. So.
I think, Richard, you can speak to the idea that I can tell you, our feeling about dealing with our members, we don't want to cry wolf on everything. So I think I've said this several times and we put it in our newsletter. If we send you out an alert, that means we need the help on this bill. We think there's a risk to the landowners on this bill. And I can tell you the response we get when we do that, I get stopped in the hall immediately by a legislator who hears from a constituent of one of our members. And they will stop me in the hall and say, "What in the world is going on?" Because they're, and Richard can tell you, it doesn't take too many calls to a legislator before they pay attention, right, Richard?
Absolutely. I saw this happen. I saw Tom Doak in the halls, and it was a senator from Cape Elizabeth that had been getting phone calls from our members. And she went running over to him asking what was going on. What was all this about? So there's the perfect opportunity. He gets to explain a particular bill that her constituents were complaining to her about. And that's exactly what we want to happen.
I see Diane Moore on, and I know that Diane brought up a question to that it was about tree growth. And I know she responded to the legislator because that legislator sought me out and wanted to know what in the world is going on in the tree growth tax law program. And we saw the same thing on Sunday hunting, to be honest with you. The biggest fight we've had in a long time was the last year. And the other side had these here, fill in the blank, kind of things, that you just put your name in. It's the same message. And the legislature gets 100 of those. Those don't mean much to a legislator. But if they get, and our members did a fabulous job of just saying to these legislators, these are my words. And I can guarantee you those legislators paid attention when they started to get 5, 6, 8, 10 emails, and they were all individually written, and they were all talking about, their concerns. And right, Richard, those mean a lot more than the the ones that, here's 100 with the same message with somebody's name tagged on it, right?
When you see it happening right in front of you, see Tom Doak is under the dome in the State House, and you see a state senator who doesn't know anything about forestry running to find him, and talking, yelling at him, basically saying, "What is going on here? Why are my people calling me because of this bill?" She doesn't know anything about the bill.
Right.
And she's looking to Tom Doak to explain what's happening. She becomes a vote in favor of whatever it is Maine woodland owners wants.
Right.
And so if anybody has any doubts about contacting their legislator, just getting to know them, who they are, so that when they call for a reason, I'm telling you, it happens when you see it happening, you're a believer, basically.
And it doesn't, Richard, on your end of it, it doesn't take a lot. I mean, you don't have to be elegant in talking to the, I mean, you can just call them up or send them a note and just express your concern, right? I mean, it
Yep.
doesn't have to be a fancy, drawn out,
No.
perfectly edited note to them, right? It can just be a quick phone call or an email or whatever, right? And say, I don't want this, and this hurts me, and I don't want it, and don't pass this, and right? I mean, it can be, it doesn't have to be this thing you
Yeah.
worry about.
I used to get a call from a dairy farmer up in Cornish on Sunday nights. He was an old guy. He used to talk, and sometimes I knew more about the bill that he wanted to talk about than he did.
Yeah.
But he just wanted to make sure I was paying attention.
Yeah.
So Monday nights there would be a conversation, and he was always nice. He never criticized anybody.
Right.
He may have hated the governor, but you never knew it. He was very polite, and but he was reliable. Let's put it that way.
Well, it made a huge help. It was a huge help on something. When we do this, it is an enormous help because I can get up and say, this is what landowners think. And they'll look at me, yeah, well, how do you know? No, right? I've been doing this 20 years and I do know, but they'll say, how do you know? But it's a little different when they say, well, I guess he was right because I got a bunch of notes from landowners that feel that same way.
Yeah.
And that really helps when on a close vote, when you got a legislator that's thinking this over. And even those that vote against you, they may vote against you, but they're careful that they're not gonna advocate against you when it comes up. They may vote no or yes, opposite way, but they're gonna be silent on the outcome. And that sometimes is what you need as well. So
they'll be paying attention when it happens the second time too. So
they will be paying attention the second time.
there are 2,000 bills in the legislature, and it's highly likely that you'll need to talk to them about more than one.
The other thing, as I think I've said, is that people think that the hearing is the action, but it's not. The hearing is the show. It's the conversations that you have with outside the hearing schedule, that outside the formal hearing process is what you really make the headway with the legislator. And I have legislators that will I'll be in a hearing and something will be said and they'll look at me like they'll say, step out in the hall, like they'll shake their head. And meet me out in the hall. Tell me, what the heck does this mean anyway? Or that person just said this. Is this true? Because sometimes you can say, well, go back and ask them this question. When you give them a question to ask or something. And that's really helpful. So you have legislators that will look right at you, and that means they're looking for something from you. And sometimes when I was director of the Forest Service, I can tell you, I could sit there and they would look at me and I would just go, like, I wouldn't say anything. I just shake my head no. And you could see, well, that's not going, you could see that legislator, I'm not voting for that.
Right.
So that's how just being in the room makes a difference.
Yeah.
Tom, I'm sorry, you might have asked this or might have already addressed this, but I know that there's a tight budget this year in the state legislature. Are there any of the important programs? Do you know anything about the budget, and if any of the important programs that we have for woodland owners resources, are any of them in jeopardy, or is there anything that we need to keep an eye on?
I would say I don't know of any budget cut relating specifically to programs that really impact landowners. being it's gonna be on the federal side, there's all kinds of things going on that we're working on, but. In the state budget, I am not aware of any cut. That would have any significant impact on woodland owners at this point. Sometimes you get into, I said there's no bill on tree growth. There is a reimbursement program with tree growth. Sometimes you get into, the budget gets cut on the reimbursement, and the municipalities are upset and they want to change the tree growth tax law program or something. So sometimes you'll see that, but on its face, I don't see any right now that are gonna say, oh my gosh, this is gonna have an impact. An important program that landowners are involved in.
Tom, how about there's a lot of news about the spruce budworm. What about that?
Yeah, so there's spruce budworm affects most and it impacts spruce and fir as a native pest, but it's episodic and it's about a 40-year window when it returns. It's this year, the egg counts are such that it looks like there's going to be a major infestation in northern Maine to start. About 250,000 acres that are at high risk for defoliation of spruce and fir trees. 40,000 acres of that is on small private owners. The rest is on the larger ownerships. And there is a budget item. The federal government has appropriated $12 million to help with the spraying of this insect with the biological insecticides. The legislature, the governor has $2 million in her budget to help the costs, including the cost of covering these smaller ownerships. The larger ownerships are putting money into the pot, but there's no expectation that small landowners will. But there's a hope that some of these small landowners will also spray because they're trying to suppress the outbreak so it doesn't spread. In Quebec, they've tried this approach in New Brunswick and it's been successful in keeping the budworm epidemic, kind of the outbreak compressed. In Quebec, they didn't, and they've got a massive problem. And so the idea is push the population down and let the natural predators control it. And that's the concept, and it's proved to work in New Brunswick. But there's a fight in the budget right now, fight over the governor's proposed is the budget, the change package to the budget, which the governor put in from the existing budget would be altered. And there's $2 million in there the governor put in, and that is one of the items they're fighting over, whether to put any money into the to help on the dealing with the spruce budworm. That's one of the things that's been holding up the agreement, apparently. So I don't know whether to go. We're thinking that that's a good investment, but that bill they're going to have to resolve the budget issue. There's two ways to do it. One is to make an agreement between the Democrats and the Republicans and pass something. The other way to do it, and they started this process, was the Democrats all line up because they have the majority in both chambers, pass the bill without the Republicans, then adjourn the legislature so that starts a 90-day window of bills becoming effective after adjournment and spend the rest of the time in a special session. That's been done before. It's not the preferred way, but right now they're there at a stalemate. So I would not be surprised ultimately to see eventually that scenario play itself out. But we don't know yet. Any other thoughts or questions? Or if you ever want to see how the legislature works in person, you're welcome to come and join me one day. I can show you around and you can go and sit in a hearing and maybe even get up and say something. You're welcome to. You're always welcome. Anybody can say anything at a hearing. But if you ever want, but you can also. All of them are televised. So if you go on the legislature website, you can watch the hearings and the work sessions. And they're also recorded, so you can watch them. And it's sometimes sometimes it's just pure entertainment. I got to tell you, there are days you just want to be there and eating popcorn and watch, because there are days that it's just pure entertainment, but not most days. But every once in a while, it's like, well, this is really kind of fascinating to see how it goes. So.
Okay. And as always, you can email Tom or
Yep.
me, whichever, Tom at, or Jen at with 2 N's, and we're mainwoodlandowners.org as our email address.
And we'll keep people updated in the newsletter, and we'll be posting more. The legislature is really kind of just gearing up now. It's early, the first month or two are pretty slow, but we'll have updates on our webpage, and watch for an alert, because if we do send you an alert, that means there's a struggle coming on a bill that's important. So
Well, thank you, everyone. It's great to have you here. And we'll do this again probably towards the end of the session, Tom.
yeah, that'd be great.
Just to keep everybody up to speed. Even though it's a slower year than usual, the vigilance is important, and the consistency of our presence in this realm is really important. So thank you very much.
And thank you for those of you that have reached out to your legislators when we've asked. So that's a huge help to me, and to us.
All right. Have a great rest of your evening, and we'll see everybody at our next events. Thanks. Bye.